get started with some introductions to this session and what lies ahead. And please feel free to keep introducing yourselves, your department, and your name in the chat. So many of you will have heard this previously as you've been joining, but for those who are just coming in, there are some links that I'm going to throw up again in the chat, one to the slide deck and another to the communication plan template. I can share these at any point if you're looking to get reconnected with these. The communication template we will be discussing in today's presentation, so it will come up again later on. So I guess in terms of introductions, I should introduce myself. My name is Dr. Lauren Anstey. I'm an educational developer at the Center for Teaching and Learning and will be leading today's session on communicating with students, of course, with a special focus on communicating in this remote and digital landscape that we are finding ourselves in now and into the fall. I also wanted to recognize that I'm being joined and helped by other members from the Center for Teaching and Learning. So Caitlin McDonald is joining me in support, as well as Carolyn McRae, Educational Development Fellow in the Center for Teaching and Learning. So thank you both for being here, and they will help me manage some of the chat. And I believe we may have Selena joining us as well. Selena from the Center for Teaching and Learning may be popping in terms of tech support. So we will get started with the presentation formally. With a couple of announcements in terms of how we can use this space to the best of our ability. So I think many of you have already done this. It's always helpful to have your microphone on mute when you are not speaking. It reduces some of the background noise. You'll hear the birds outside my window, my children coming into the room, and so we'll try to reduce that background noise as much as possible. Of course, though, there are times where you might want to flag my attention or raise a question, raise a point, and always feel free to unmute your microphone to contribute. One handy feature is the raise hand icon that gets my attention, alerting me to your desire to speak up. And I always suggest people expand the chat feed, as we have been sharing some links and resources there, as well as some introductions to the who's in the room. So if you're unfamiliar with that, you can click the chat window there. So is the slide available through the CTL? Yeah, actually, I'm happy to share it, Sean. I have built it in Google Slides. So there is a way that I can get that shared. It will take me a minute to get all the permissions set up correctly, but it's something that I will note and share along. Because yeah, I find it helpful to have this sort of orientation and show people what's what as we get going. Another important note on this slide is that we are recording this session today. So if you do not wish to be viewed in that recording, then please do not activate your camera to turn that off. And just so that everyone knows, the chat and the conversation happening there doesn't get associated with the recording. It doesn't become public when we share the video. So your comments there remain, private to this arena in this conversation. So today we're talking about communicating with students, and there's always lots of talk around maybe some of our what we notice about student communication in the regular term, when we're teaching in a normal circumstance. And I have been in lots of conversation recently with instructors who have maybe an added concern as we go to this remote environment, that the common experiences and complaints that we might have about the way students communicate with us, or the ways that we might have information in a variety of locations, and it never really feels like all the students by any means are checking in with those avenues. So this is a timely conversation that I hope would help mitigate an email like this that you're seeing from PhD Comics that kind of pokes fun at some of the common complaints, but to me it hits home in what I generally hear about communication with students and some of the common concerns. And so what we're going to talk about today is really centered around devising a communication plan. So the template that I've shared is actually a resource that you can use in building your communication plan, because what we're proposing in this session is that if you can come up with a plan, if you can articulate specific elements of your expectations around communication, so specifically for a course, you might develop a communication plan for every course that you're teaching, that would be a way in which you are able to make explicit some of the expectations that you hold for yourself in communicating outward to your students, but also for your students communicating to you. And right now, I think when I say you, I mean the teaching team broadly. So it might be, you, the instructor, but it might also be you and your co-instructors, or you and your TAs, depending on your context. Other things that I'd like to cover today in staying true to the course or into this workshop description is to highlight some communication technologies that you might find helpful, or you might employ as you are developing your communication plan. And to some strategies that I have come across, that I have learned from in managing your communications load. So what I mean by this is that often what I hear from instructors is that it's just a huge load, a huge burden in many ways to manage the communications around a course. So you spend a lot of your time answering questions that maybe the answer was provided in the syllabus, fielding those additional concerns or questions that are coming in from students. And while that is incredibly important, it can start to take up more time than you really have to afford to that kind of activity for your course. And so finding some ways, especially in this remote environment, to streamline that communications so that you can spend more of your time on the teaching elements and on really on your marking, on getting to know students. The more that you can kind of divert attention away from answering emails, fielding questions, the more you've got to dedicate to all your other responsibilities, teaching and beyond. So that's the plan for this session. Please feel free at any point to raise any questions, to raise your hand and speak up. I will continue to move forward with the webinar, and we will, of course, be leaving time for questions and conversation towards the end of the presentation as well. So I have included the link to your communication plan template that is a resource that you can use for building a communication plan. And I would say the bulk of this template really does guide many of the suggestions that we would have from the Center for Teaching and Learning in terms of strategies for effectively communicating, particularly in a remote setting. So that communication template includes these 5 elements. When thinking of writing or articulating what you expect out of communications in your course, the first consideration that you might want to consider is the methods for your outgoing communications. So what strategies you will use for communicating out to your students, what tools you'll use, those sorts of details. And the template really speaks to some pertinent questions around that area. How will your communication methods change depending on the different types of information being shared? Because often instructors will pick one line of communication for a message that needs to go to everyone, but they will want to specify for students, if you need to contact me about private matters, personal matters, then use this line of communication, such as email. And that really leads in well to the second section of the template. How should students contact you? Through what avenues? What do you prefer? I know some instructors would be very clear about email being the only line of communication they wish to employ. Others actually prefer or want to provide a phone number in which they could be called at. It's personal preference, of course. And so really giving some pause and consideration to how students might be contacting you. One important consideration here, of course, and it's built into the template, is for those who have TA resources. One of the suggestions coming out of much of the feedback from students, TAs, and instructors who have tried this is to elaborate on where on what topics students should be contacting their TAs, and in what ways students should be contacting you, the instructor. So you'll see within the template, one of the things we've excuse me, built into that is some sample text. So for example, your text might read, questions about course assignments, labs, or grading should be addressed to the TA. And any questions regarding academic accommodations or personal circumstances can be directed to the instructor. And then providing that contact information following that statement. So as you work through the template, you will see these pertinent questions as well as some sample text that demonstrates the kind of language that you could be borrowing. Moving along through the elements of this template, a consideration of the frequency or schedule of your communications. I know when I have taught in the past, one of the things that I committed to in then sort of an implicit communication plan was that I was going to make weekly announcements through OnCue and the announcements tool. And I decided this at the beginning of the term and stuck with it the whole way through the term, which helped students get used to the idea as to when to expect these weekly announcements and that they would be showing up in their inboxes or in OnCue. So giving some thought as to when you plan to send out regular communications, if you're ever not available. So for example, some instructors will declare that Sunday is a time that they will not be checking in on their course or not answering their emails. And that's totally appropriate and helpful to express to students. Recommended frequency, of students' communication activities. So how often should students be checking in? Students might actually ask that question as to what you expect. And while it's maybe difficult to, be accurate with your prediction as to how frequently, it should be up to the students in managing their participation. But if you can offer some guidelines to them as to how they should be engaging. For example, I've seen text in syllabi that make it clear that you need to be checking your institutional email because that is the email address that I assume you will be using. Is one example of a policy or statement put into this communication plan that helps students appreciate what they should be doing in terms of checking in and participating in the course. And finally, a very small section in the template that prompts you to think about any contingencies that you might want to put in place. So I've never really done this myself. It was something suggested out of the literature and the resources that I referred to in helping to build this template. But there was a suggestion of thinking about, say, for example, your internet goes down. This is a really terrible example. But if there's something that interrupts your regular communications, what are those avenues for addressing that contingency? So my hope is, so Sean's offering the example here, the RMC network being shut down for a few weeks. Great example, right? So when you have an unexpected major disruption, if you can already have some of those contingency plans sorted out or decided on as to where, how you're going to shift, then you will be, better poised to be able to communicate that to your students and pivot to that line of communication. So maybe I will pause and check in if you have had a chance to access the template. But of course, I would hope that you're letting me know if you're unable to access that. It can actually be downloaded and be used as a Word document by clicking on the download button on the window that you see when you click that link. and is totally editable. So I would suggest removing as much of the pre-existing text and putting in your own um, information about these different sections and answering some of those prompting questions. Not all the questions will apply to you, and so if a question gets omitted, then by all means, I think it's an important decision to tailor it to your needs. But I will say that this plan might be considered an internal course document, so something that you're creating for you at first. I would also highly encourage that if you are working in a team of any nature, co-instructors or you and your TAs, that there's the opportunity to co-develop this plan together where that's appropriate. So you're sort of building this template or this plan on your own outside of the course. I wouldn't suggest necessarily sharing this document directly with students, but I would suggest finding ways of sharing the information that you write within the plan with your students in some way. And the typical way would be within the syllabus. So to add some elements within the syllabus to that you might actually draw from a couple different sections of your communication plan into the syllabus to create maybe a single statement that combines a couple different elements. So for example, that you will be using email or on-cue announcements, maybe on a weekly schedule, and that students should be actively checking their email, logging into on-cue at a regular basis, and that they might expect a reply from you to that email within 24 hours, noting that weekends might be slower. That tends to be a common statement I have seen in course syllabi, that you can see how it draws on a couple different elements of this communication plan. Are there any strategies out there that you have tried, or statements that you really like within your syllabus that you've found helpful? I invite you to share that either by speaking up using your microphone or in the chat. I'll keep going for now, but always feel free to be contributing in that sense. The next question I tend to get when it comes to communication. Oh, Carolyn, go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's happening on anyone else's end, but I'm having trouble seeing your slides at the moment, Lauren. I'm kind of getting an image that I know isn't your slides that's kind of thinking about it. So I'm not sure if anyone else is experiencing that. But I just thought I'd bring that up.
Great, thank you.
Oh, okay. Everyone else is good, so it's on my end.
Okay, and if you are having disruptions to the slides, I'm going to post the link because you'll be able to access the slide deck in Google Slides. Right now, I'm on the Common Communications Technologies slide, which is slide 7. And thanks to those who confirmed that it's all good. So great question, Kathleen. I will address that in a moment because I think the short answer to your question is yes. I'm just very briefly having a look at some of the comments that came in. And I think one of the facilitation skills I'm developing is the ability to talk and read and comprehend all at once, which I'm not even sure is if the cognitive scientists would say that's possible. So Sean sharing that he's used emails and a couple different options in the past, and maybe hasn't tried setting the reply timeline deadline. I've included a deadline in or a timeline in my course syllabi. I teach grad students and typically courses of 25 to 30, and so I really haven't necessarily seen that policy being tested, but I always find it helpful in alleviating my burden in feeling like over the weekend, if I don't get to it immediately, that's okay, because I've communicated that to my students that I consider my weekend downtime. I know other instructors will feel differently, and that's why it's important to come up with a statement that really suits you. Great. So Kathleen's asking a question: is there a calendar or interactive document that students can schedule a time for meeting with the teaching team? And I think there's probably a couple of ways to do that, Kathleen. I would suggest, my immediate thought is actually an embedded Google Doc into OnCue. We can connect about that afterwards. And I know that there's some other third-party platforms that would allow for scheduling. So I can't, what doesn't immediately come to mind, but I'm going to flag this question for Selena in hopes that she will pop on and be able to join us for that, because it might take some creativity in coming up with a seamless way of facilitating that. So the slide that you're looking at right now is a curated list of some of the common technologies. So I say curated because there are lots of technologies out there. I have limited this to those tools that are institutionally supported, and I actually haven't even profiled all of the institutionally supported tools that might be used for communications, but the most common or the most frequent that I see being used right now as we talk and discuss some strategies for remote teaching in the fall. So the way that this is organized is there are, of course, asynchronous forms of communication. So messaging that doesn't require you to be in the same digital time and space as your students. So email is the perfect example. I send an email, someone checks it 3 hours later and replies to me, and I check that and reply to it on half an hour later. Synchronous, in opposite, is when you are in the same time and space. So right now we're all joining Microsoft Teams, and specifically the meeting function within Teams. So synonymous to this would be Zoom in the same sort of web meeting capacity. And both of those would be technologies that could be used for synchronous communication, and often it's being used to connect with many people all at once. You could connect one-on-one with students through something like Microsoft Teams, even Zoom. So one-to-one being you connecting to a student. And so the way that this graph is organized, I'll go through some of the different options. If you are looking for synchronous one-to-one communications, then I wanted to highlight the OnCue chat function, which is basically an instant messaging platform built into OnCue that would allow you to specify which individual student or small group of students you wish to communicate with, and you're sending them a chat message through OnCue. However, switching to asynchronous means very similar sort of platform is Microsoft Teams and the chat function built into that. So a similar sort of instant messaging style form of communication, chat promoting more of like a synchronous, like you're both online on OnCue at the same time and you're using that chat function to message back and forth. Microsoft Teams chat tends to be more used in an asynchronous, unless you do know that everyone's online at the same time. Asynchronous to many tends to be a common area of exploration. So this would be a message that you can send out, say, to everyone or to groups of students that can be checked in at a particular time. So OnCue announcements being the leading platform. Intelligent agents I will actually speak to a little bit later on because it might be something that you're not too familiar with, or Microsoft Teams channels. So setting up channels within Teams that belong to certain groups within your course. Jennifer asking a question, is there institutional support for Slack? And I do not believe that there is, although I do hear lots of examples of instructors using and teams using Slack for communication. If there's no institutional support, it by no means omits you from using that tool. You could still be using a non institutionally supported platform. My recommendation is to give some consideration to accounts and sign up, and then the security and privacy of you and your students. something like Slack that's so common. Lots of students will potentially already be familiar with that platform. And there's some really great benefit added by exploring some of the third-party platforms that are available. I would just, select those judiciously and something that you're going to feel comfortable with, and trust that you can communicate that in an effective way with students. So that's why on this slide I did kind of limit it to the tools that are here at Queen's. So if you have accessed these slides in Google Slides, so clicking the link and accessing them there are links built into the notes section of this slide that give you links outward to the support pages, say, for example, about on-cue announcements or about intelligent agents, because I recognize that it's not possible within this time frame to be diving, a lot more deeply into these technologies, but that often these questions arise. We also have been running on-cue support drop-ins. Selena Idlis from the Center for Teaching and Learning every Tuesday and Thursday has been running those, which is really great for dropping in on specific questions that you have. And I'm just going to grab the link for that that has the information about those drop-ins that I've added there to the chat. So now a bit of a shift in topics. If you continue to have some questions about technologies, please feel free to note them in the chat. We might come back around to them at the end of the section, because I think this is my last sort of chunk of presenting, and we'll have lots of time dedicated to questions and answers specific to your needs. This last section, like I mentioned, is really about managing your communications load, because in the past 10 years, I have gone from grad student to professor and observed that change that happens from taking the 1.3 days, as this comic suggests, to write this beautifully worded email, to putting that professor hat on and answering questions really briefly, really quickly, because I'm just simply, I'm refining how my comfort level with communications, and it also comes down to you just have to get some of your communications off your inbox and responded to. So it's about a balance, in terms of providing enough detail and support to students while also getting that done efficiently. A quick answer of yes, oftentimes might leave a student feeling left, even more confused than when they first started. So finding the balance between a quick response and a helpful response. And I wanted to drum up some of the ideas around creative strategies that you can use to manage your communication load, because the communications plan and that template will probably get you to like 85% of the way there, to pick an arbitrary percentage. That if you could outline all of your feelings or ideas around a communication plan within that document, and you could share that out with students and come up with your weekly communication schedule, that would actually alleviate a lot of the oftentimes burden that I hear instructors speak about, and that I've experienced as well in teaching. However, you might want to consider some additional strategies that of course get built into this communication plan, but I wanted to speak to some of those creative strategies and share what I have heard about, what I have learned in terms of creatively addressing your load to reduce it to a manageable level. And the three elements that I'm going to be discussing are weekly announcements, automated elements, automated messaging, and creative communication technologies that you could consider. So first, weekly announcements. This is an example of, so on the right of the screen, you're seeing an announcement that I had made. As I had mentioned in one of my grad courses, I had the practice of weekly announcements. So this was week 9. And what I'm doing in that weekly announcement is orienting students to the week ahead. Important updates, reminders as to what's happening, clarifications around any confusing topics that I have heard about over the week prior. It's really an opportunity. I mean, oftentimes I think this is mimicking those first 15 minutes in a face-to-face lecture where you spend some time checking in, responding to what you've heard, it maybe in your office hours or in conversation with students more generally. The on-cue announcements tool is really awesome in that it doesn't need to just be static text. It can be images, it can be embedded video. So you can see on this screenshot, the YouTube video is directly within that announcement, so students can quickly play it. And I've also embedded quick surveys. So say, for example, a Microsoft Forms survey that goes right into the announcements that asks questions like, I was collecting midterm feedback, the stop, start, continue on my teaching, and had students quickly access it through there. So oftentimes when I speak to instructors about what have you employed to alleviate your communications, what has helped you the most, it almost always comes back to weekly announcements, quick videos that instructors have recorded with maybe half an hour dedicated in your time to record that video. So no high production, just you talking to a camera often. I tend to use PowerPoint slides that structure a little bit. You know, if I'm going to remind students about readings, I've got that noted on the slide, but otherwise low stakes in getting that up and running. Great point, Carolyn. Carolyn's suggesting that the announcements can be set up with timed release. So she's suggesting, you know, she writes hers on Fridays and they release on Mondays, which is really helpful in maintaining your schedule of announcements and giving you some flex time in the ways that you prepare those announcements. The other tool I wanted to highlight that I've been experimenting with myself is on-cue intelligent agents. So this is a tool that allows you to set up some criteria and write an email that's going to be sent out to students if those students meet those criteria. So there's lots of different ways in which this can be used. The two bullet points here on the slide suggest the negative feedback and the positive feedback approach. In terms of negative feedback, a message about poor performance. So for example, they haven't logged into on-cue in 2 weeks. That's a concern, and you could have intelligent agents automatically send an email to say, you write this email, of course, but you know, you haven't logged into on-cue in 2 weeks. I highly suggest, you know, please reach out to me if you need some added support. But there's lots of ways you could take that, right? So to get their attention, to encourage help seeking, etc. On the flip side is to message after good performance. So if they have been particularly engaged in on-cue, say for example, they post to the discussion boards on a high frequency, and you wanted to send a note to say, you know, thanks for your engagement in the course. Your discussion posts have stimulated some really great conversation. So I think there's lots of support in terms of setting up this intelligent agents. It takes some getting used to in terms of how you're going to use it and making sure that the criteria and all the fields are appropriate. But I have found a lot of the help documentation really great around agents, and I have included a link to that in the Google Slides. I can post it as well in the chat right here. Another way in which you can automate, and this is a strategy that I had heard in conversation with an instructor at my previous institution, is setting up an automated email reply. And I guess this is the point too, where I wanted to pause and just recognize that all of these strategies will, some of these strategies will resonate with some people, that not all of these strategies will resonate with all people, of course. I personally don't know how I feel about this automated email reply, but I propose it because I think there's some value in sending out an automatic email reply to folks. And so this would involve using your automatic replies, much like you do when you set up your vacation message, that would automatically say, you know, maybe in bold, course 101 students, please note that I reply to course-related emails on weekdays and strive to reply within 24 hours. I've even seen the suggestion of adding a line like, as a policy, I don't reply to emails where I know the answer is easily found in the syllabus or in some other avenue. Like, say, for example, you've set up a question and an answer, frequently asked questions page. You could be suggesting to students that you're simply not going to reply to an email if that question can already be found somewhere else. I frame that with my sort of hesitation in that I would worry I would miss an email and that a student is assuming that maybe they should be able to find that information elsewhere. It could add to added confusion. But I think that there's some value in saying, okay, if your email is very simple and straightforward and could be answered some other way, then please check that other place. I'll also flag that there's no way, unless you have a course-specific email, like if you're using your regular user ID and your email there, there's no way to filter out this automatic reply. So only emails that come in about the course will receive this automated response. Everyone who emails you would see this automated response. So maybe not ideal in that sense. And finally, some creative communication technologies. I've heard from some folks, I have not tried this myself, that setting up a Facebook group has been advantageous to some. They really prefer to use Facebook because it seems to offer the kind of communication that they want between them and their students and student to student. And then another tool that I'll share is Piazza, a third-party tool not supported by Queen's, but one that is an interactive discussion board that seems to have a couple features that instructors really like. So, for example, if one student posts a question and another student comes in and answers it with a very appropriate response, you as the instructor can endorse that answer and say, this is the answer right here. As an instructor, I don't need to answer this question again because student B has answered it beautifully. You can mark questions as being a good question or a good answer. So it just has some flexibility to, it seems, that some instructors really resonate towards. So again, lots of support from Piazza in getting that set up and profiling what the platform actually does, but worth mentioning here in a creative solution to your communications approach. And I think with that, I want to leave the remaining time for questions. My email is here on the slide if you would prefer to connect afterwards. But I leave the floor open to your thoughts and comments and questions that you might have. Awesome comment here from Kathleen. Students are saying they're concerned about the amount of new technologies that they will have to access and even learn like how to use. So absolutely, I echo that concern. In terms of recommendations on the limit of different tools, I don't have a magic number to offer, other than to suggest you are limiting the number of tools to the absolute essential. So OnCue does a lot that covers a lot of bases. So that you would I always suggest that as the foundational tool that you're using. And then if you're going to use a third-party platform that like takes you out of OnCue, because there's lots that you can actually build in, other stuff that you can build into OnCue. And in some ways that reduces the student's burden of having to learn, because if it's just something that they can quickly engage in within OnCue and not have to leave, great. But the learning curve goes up when they have to create new accounts, when they have to learn how to go into that account and play around. And so I would suggest limiting that to the one or two additional places where a student might have to go. Teams, for example, or Piazza. That's kind of my thought around that question. It's difficult to judge. There's also the consideration of when students are doing assignments and completing assignments that I have always suggested, for example, if it's a very creative assignment, like creating an infographic, I might provide students some guidance on the top 2 technologies that could be used for that. PowerPoint, Canva, those are great technologies for creating visual materials. But leaving students with the flexibility to make that choice for themselves. So I'm not saying you have Coggle, another fantastic example. You don't have to use Coggle, you don't have to use Canva, because students will have solutions for themselves that they'll want to use in many circumstances. So wherever you can, affording the option for students to select the tools, I find that really helps too. So yeah, of course, please note that as we shift towards questions, that some folks will feel like they took away what they needed to from here. And I would invite you to please fill out the evaluation form that Caitlin has just posted in the chat. And don't be afraid to pop off of this session when you feel like you've had your fill, but I will, of course, stay here for the next 20 minutes or so for having conversation and addressing any questions as they arise. Thanks, Maggie.